National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is out, a seeming fait accompli after weeks of criticism that began well before President Trump ever took office. His departure comes in the wake of reports that he discussed easing sanctions with the Russian ambassador and then, according to a senior official, misled the vice president and other senior administration officials about the nature of his conversations. That caused a concern he might be susceptible to blackmail.
In a resignation letter released by the White House, Flynn wrote in part this: "Unfortunately, because of the fast pace of events, I inadvertently briefed the vice president-elect and others with incomplete information regarding my phone calls with the Russian ambassador. I have sincerely apologized to the president and the vice president, and they've accepted my apology."
A senior official tells NBC News the president and advisors have been, quote, agonizing over what to do about Flynn for days. But ultimately, the situation became unsustainable, not because of the discussion of the sanctions, but because he had lied to the president and the vice president, and I'm adding here, it all became public.
And a source close to the president says that it was the vice president himself, something that we haven't talked about enough over the first hour. It was the vice president himself who was a key driver behind Flynn's exit last night.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. It's Tuesday, February 14th. Still with us on set, we have political analyst Mark Halperin, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, commentary editor for the Washington Examiner, Tim Carney, columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, and join the conversation, New York Times columnist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Tom Friedman. Also with us, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent and host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, Andrea Mitchell. All right, great panel here. Incredible, fast-moving events. I think we should go through point by point what happened, and then look at the questions surrounding exactly who knew what when, which I think go back weeks. Despite some early signs yesterday of trouble for Flynn, White House counselor Kellyanne Conway said yesterday afternoon that Flynn was still in good standing with the president.
General Flynn does enjoy the full confidence of the president. General Flynn has said he can't recall, and that he had about 30 phone calls with I guess, leaders at the time, and since then 70, I'm told, with different leaders, and I'll just leave his comments at that.
By saying he enjoys the full confidence of the president, are you saying you're satisfied that he did not have those conversations, that he did not mislead the vice president?
No, those are two different questions. You asked me, and I'll repeat the answer, does he have the full confidence of the president? Yes, he does. Then you're asking me, what did he talk about with people when I wasn't on the phone? So the only way for me to answer that is to tell you what he has said, which is that he can't recall.
Mark, the question that John Meacham asked last hour is important.
It is.
And that is whether Kellyanne Conway was out of the loop, as she often is, or whether she was in the loop. It is far more disturbing for the White House if she was read in, and the president sent her out there to say that at 4 o'clock, 4:30, when they've known for a month, and certainly knew over the past weekend, that the Justice Department had said that this man was susceptible to blackmail and something needed to be done.
There's some aspects of this that are, of course, extraordinary. We've talked about them. This piece is not. We see all the time presidents are the last who are willing to cut somebody loose. Even when the vice president and other top White House officials have been saying for at least a couple days he had to go.
But Steve Bannon was reported was actually fighting to keep him in there.
Well, at some point he flipped as well, too, as I understand it. But look, this is a huge story, not because the president's national security advisor quit, but because it goes back to his judgment, it goes back to Russia, and it goes back to ongoing investigations by the Department of Justice, concerns in the intelligence community about the president and his former national security advisor's direct relationship to Russia. This will be investigated both by the executive branch and by Congress.
Yeah, Alex, what did you just tell me? Did you say that the Times said on Friday that Bannon was saying to cut him loose?
Yeah, the New York Times reporting that Bannon was pushing for Flynn's resignation as of Friday.
I read something over the weekend that said that Bannon was actually talked to him and was trying to keep him in there, so that's good to know.
And I have indications Reince Priebus was pushing for him to go.
I knew Reince was pushing for him to go.
So the question again is why the president was staying loyal to him.
Because the
Partly out of
president talked
loyalty,
with him
but-
about this conversation with the Russian ambassador.
That is what you're hearing.
Donald Trump flew on planes all over the country campaigning with Flynn by his side as the guy who kept him calm, as the guy who talked with him while he was traveling and during moments where things got quiet and he had to wait around. These guys knew about it. How does anybody at this table not look at that
And how can it be
possibility?
how can it be considered a
100%.
close call for the White House counsel and for the president when they're told by the Justice Department that he's subject to blackmail?
It's not a close call, but Willie, this is a man that does not like to admit mistakes. Even when he was publicly saying the executive order was going smoothly, he was telling his staff that it could never happen again. And so to fire a man who, quite frankly, everybody around this table said from the very beginning would be a poor fit as National Security Advisor, would be for Donald Trump to admit that he had made a mistake, despite the fact that I was hearing 2 weeks ago that he had already grown exhausted by him.
But Andrea, General Flynn was only forced out after yesterday a storm of reporting from you, from the Washington Post, from a number of sources that said the acting Attorney General, the former acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, along with Jim Clapper at DNI, John Brennan at CIA, went to the White House counsel and said, here's what happened in that phone call between Flynn and the ambassador to Russia, and here's why we believe he is ripe for blackmail.
Well, actually, the sequence was that Jim Comey and Clapper and Brennan and Yates all met on January 19th. That's when they concluded, based on the time that had elapsed between the call that was made on December 29th, and then the concerns that grew out of that call and suspicions that they had over the way Putin reacted and the way the White House was reacting to the expulsion of the diplomats / spies, no retaliation at all from Russia. So then, as days progressed, they went back and they looked at the intercepts that they have routinely of the Russian ambassador, and they saw this phone call. And then they saw the way Mike Flynn had described it in briefings to Sean Spicer. Sean Spicer then described it during the transition. And then on January 15th, when Mike Pence went on Face the Nation and again repeated the false narrative that had been fed to him by Mike Flynn, that's when they decided that this really, something had to be done. Everyone but Comey wanted to go to the new Trump incoming administration on January 19th. That's what Yates wanted, Brennan and Clapper. Brennan and Clapper, of course, had already been discredited by Flynn and fought against and all of the, the comments that you had heard during the transition. But the fact is that Yates really did want to go, and the rest of them did as well. And it was only when, after Mike Pence's Face the Nation performance, that they went back, and after January 23rd, between January 23rd and the day that Yates was fired on the 31st, that's when Yates went to the White House counsel. What we cannot understand is who did the counsel tell, and how could they have gone for all of these weeks without having taken some action.
Thomas Friedman, there's so much to unpack here. So we will defer to you and let you go where you want with this. The only question I would ask you to start with is it credible that there's any way this president could not have known about this conversation if the White House had been warned about it a month ago?
Well, this is a question I've been asking since I've been reading the stories starting yesterday, Joe. I share Mika's real outrage on this issue. I don't care what he told Pence. We only care what he told Pence because Pence went out and basically misled the public on Face the Nation. The issue is, what did he tell Trump? Did he and Trump actually cook up this whole thing? After the Russians did not respond harshly to the eviction of their spies and diplomats, Trump actually tweeted out some positive encouragement of this. Did the two of them cook this up all along? And it gets, Joe, to two other issues. The first is, we have never taken seriously from the very beginning, Russia hacked our election. That was a 9/11 scale event. They attacked the core of our very democracy. That was a Pearl Harbor scale event. Can you imagine if Hillary Clinton, where Trump was, what the right would be doing on this issue? This goes to the very core of our democracy. The second point And it gets back to this Kellyanne Conway nonsense. You know, my philosopher friend Dov Seidman likes to make the distinction between formal authority and moral authority. Trump has formal authority. In fact, that Stephen Miller guy kept telling us, you know, and Kellyanne Conway keeps telling us, we won, get over it. But Trump has no moral authority. He has squandered his moral authority by repeatedly lying, and his people repeatedly lying on issues of fact that we know about. Why is that important? Because there's going to be a point in the next few weeks or months, whether it's on an issue like North Korea or whatever, where Donald Trump is going to have to make a very hard call on the basis of intelligence. It may go bad, it may not go bad, but he's going to have to look the American people in the eye and say, trust me. And the fact that he has formal authority and no moral authority is going to be a real problem for him. All this lying is going to add up.
On that point, on that very last point, Richard Haass, I just ask, how can you not deduce that Trump knew about this conversation that Flynn had with the ambassador to Russia, given how much time they spent together and how deeply engaged they were even during the campaign? Flynn was the guy. Also, with Trump repeatedly saying he respects Vladimir Putin, being asked again and again and again and again and again the question, with even his friend Bill O'Reilly on a silver platter giving him the question again during the Super Bowl, saying, please, please, with his face, answer this in a better way. He does not. How do we not deduce that Russia has something on this president?
Well, I think what this does is it legitimizes as many investigations as you can count into what explains what has now been more, not just months, but more than a year of sustained benign interpretation of Russia's motives in the world. This is, you know, the one area where Mr. Trump has repeatedly staked out a position, quite harsh on China, but quite benign on Russia. And it raises real policy questions. Are we prepared to make good on continuing the remilitarization of NATO? Will we do anything to help Ukraine? Will we push back against Russia in the Middle East? So it raises fundamental national security questions.
In the foreign policy community, are there concerns that Russia might have something on this president?
No one can explain the question of why there has been, again, a benign take on Russia's role in the world. Russia is a disruptor.
By the way, from the beginning of the campaign, going back to December of 2015 on this show, when it basically took about 5 follow-up questions to get him to condemn Vladimir Putin for assassinating journalists.
And you have just recently the kind of equivalent statements about Putin and about Russia and the United States. No one can explain why this has been a consistent strategic perspective of this first candidate, now president. So that's a real issue. And then I think what Mark and others are getting at, I think this entire thing raises fundamental questions about the organization of the national security process. Right. You can't have several people at the White House in charge. It's almost like priorities. If you have 6 priorities, you have no priorities. If you have 6 people in charge of foreign policy, you have no one in charge of foreign policy.
Exactly. It's the Bobby Bowden rule. If you got 2 quarterbacks, you got no quarterbacks. You need one person running NSC, and you need one person managing the White House.
With a moral compass, a sense of ethics, understanding of the laws.
And they can walk in and talk to the president. If that is Reince Priebus, great. Everybody reports to Reince Priebus, and Reince Priebus goes to the president. If it is not, then the president needs to find somebody. Because either Reince is in charge or he's not in charge. And if he is not the only person in charge there, then there will continue to be chaos.
Too many competing power centers. I don't think as long as Steve Bannon's there, you can ever say that Reince is the only guy in charge.
And by the way, every chief of staff that you talk to that's run White House has said the same thing when they heard about this arrangement. They said, again, back in November, this is going to be chaos.